I've been asked to give a critique on this beautiful painting by Ravanya, and I'm just gonna let you soak this in for a moment and appreciate this. Now, Ravanya had come to me feeling like this painting needed more contrast, and they had sent me an earlier iteration, but then had scrapped it. And I agree, I think that this one is weaker than the finished piece, as I'll explain why. So I'm going to be focusing more on what makes this painting work so well, and then at the end I'll get into a lesson on how you can use visual hierarchy to tell a story in a single image. My name is Daniel and I make paintings that tell stories, and I'm also coaching, so if you would like a critique then you can check out the link in the description. But let's get into it. So first let's really look at and absorb this piece, and then let's ask ourselves what journey we just went on. My first impression was that there's this powerful elf that's shrouded in shifting clouds with this gentle, kind of loving expression on his face. But is there something more in his eyes? And right as I'm asking that question, I noticed that the smoke around his shoulders, they're not clouds, they're gnarled hands. And as I return to his face, I see a new countenance of condescension, a wolf in sheep's clothing. I become aware of the blush on his cheek. Is that a genuine affection that comes from a twisted heart, or is that an aroused hunger and satisfaction that comes from possessing a power that manipulates and contorts justice? Like, let me know what you experienced in the comments. But I'm unsettled by this contrast between holy and evil that the artist connects so beautifully. Not only do you have an expression that is loving and also threatening, you have white against this sinister red and black. We have white clouds and ghostly shapes. All these little ways where we find holiness and evil connecting together. And I think a huge element in storytelling is to pit two themes against each other for us to explore. And I see that happening in this work. Now let's do the same thing with this other version and soak this in. The first thing I see here is this ghostly spirit lightning power, which I then discover is coming from this glowing elf that seems both evil and holy at the same time. I then hone in on the expression and notice that it's not just condescending, there's a note of kindness or affection in there too. So while the themes are the same, the order of the story is different. And I find that this one, which has us see the elf and his expression first, before the evil hands, helps us unravel the story in a much more interesting way. I feel like I get to discover what's under the surface with this one, whereas with this one, I immediately recognize the character as evil. Let's pause here and talk about visual hierarchy. Visual hierarchy is used by graphic designers to control where and when people will look at their art. And think about this, people won't experience your painting in a single instant. Now, it could be within half a second, but they're going to experience one part of it, and then another, and then another. That is a sequence of events that unfolds like a story. So how you order that sequence of events is like a plot line for a book. Don't spoil the ending at the very beginning. Now, to control this narrative, you have many compositional tools at your disposal, like size, shape, angles, negative space, and more. But once I'm satisfied with the drawing, then I'll primarily focus on these three things: value, color, and edge. For your values, high contrast will draw more attention, and low contrast will go more unnoticed. The same is true for color. But it is also true that colors that are more colorful, more saturated, more vivid will stand out more than more gray colors. And lastly, sharp edges will draw attention while soft edges will fall away. So when we come back to this, the reason why we see this first is because the contrast is highest here and here. So we immediately recognize this character as an evil being, and that colors our lens from which we view the rest of the story. But for this one, the highest contrast is in the elf and the expression, right here in the eye. And so after we get this initial impression of all this white, our eyes rest on the face a little bit longer, and we're lured into the beautiful divine. And then we see the twisting, gnarled shapes, the hands, but it's too late. We've already been caught in his clutches. But we don't notice the hands until later because the contrast here is so much lower. So all that being said, I think that this piece of art really accomplishes what the artist was intending as far as communicating the story. I could nitpick a few things like how the face could be more three-dimensional with values and highlights, and we're missing some cast shadows from the hair onto the face, but all of those things would make it look more realistic. It wouldn't necessarily improve the intent of the drawing. Something that my art teacher, Kevin Murphy, really helped me with was understanding that there's lateral changes and vertical changes. A vertical change would be a change that actually creates an improvement to the intention of the painting, whereas a lateral change could be a change that maybe you just want to happen, but it's not necessarily going to improve the piece. And I think we're getting into this territory here. But let's say that Ravanya still feels like the painting doesn't have enough contrast in it. So you wouldn't want to increase the contrast globally. You would still want to maintain the same visual hierarchy you had before, only expand the range. So the areas that have the highest contrast would get even higher contrast, while the areas with low contrast could stay where they are, or vice versa. And actually, I do like this, where I've softened the contrast in the background, which only pulls the contrast that's already existing in the foreground. It makes it more prominent. It does open up the space a little bit more, which may or may not be what Ravanya wants, but it does strengthen the visual hierarchy. Color is another dimension that Ravanya could have played with without changing the value hierarchy, which is really driving the story. She could have played around with using complementary colors and things like that to bring in more of a pop to the overall impression of the work. You can see me playing around with some color edits here, but none of these are really working. You most likely would have to plan those kinds of things out from the very beginning. And going back to this one, I don't think that there's anything wrong with this plot line. You could have a redemptive arc in your story if you started off with a character being evil, and then we saw that glimpse of good at the end. But I think for this piece, that story would have needed to be refined a little bit more. And my final musings are just how cool it is that we think of art as a moment captured in time. And in many ways it is, but we don't experience it that way. We can bring time into a timeless piece by controlling when people look at something in our work. And I think there's something really cool about that. If you like Ravanya's work, then you can follow her on Kara. She's working on a grim, dark fantasy comic that I think is very fitting for her morally ambiguous character here. But yeah, I hope that this video helped you see something you hadn't seen before in what you might be capable of in telling stories with your art. Have a beautiful day.